London did not slow for executions. It gathered pace. Carts moved aside on the Strand to clear the way for the mounted guards. Windows opened along the upper floors of timbered houses. The air bore the sour tang of dung and river rot, mixed now with sweat and excitement. August heat clung to the skin. Men pressed forward for a better view. Children perched on barrels or shoulders. They had come to see the end of a man whose name had echoed like a challenge from the north, William Wallace. He was bound tightly to a wooden hurdle dragged behind a horse from the Tower, through the dirty streets, his body jolting with every rut and stone. Filth from the road smeared into the wounds already worked into his skin. The people shouted, some cursed, others jeered, but not all. Some were quiet, watching with that fixed stare the condemned always drew. No one could mistake this for simple justice. This was theater. The sentence had been pronounced days earlier at Westminster Hall. Treason. The king's voice had not been needed. His law spoke plainly through his justiciars. Wallace had refused to bow to Edward, had led rebels, had spilled English blood. For that, no sword would grant mercy. The punishment was reserved for the worst, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was not only to end life, it was designed to dismantle the soul in the eyes of all who watched. At Smithfield, the crowd pressed close to the scaffold. The noise dropped to a murmur as the execution began. Wallace was pulled upright, lashed tight. He said nothing that could be heard. If he prayed, it was silent, lost beneath the creaking of timber and the whisper of cloth against wood. The rope was slung. They hanged him not to death, but to the brink until the body twitched, until the lungs seized in desperate silence. Cut down gasping, he was stripped and laid upon a bench. The next part was slower, deliberate. It had to be. The drawing was not the dragging, as some believed, but a disemboweling, a calculated undoing of the body from the inside still alive. It was a spectacle of control, an anatomy lesson in what it meant to betray the crown. The executioner was skilled. He had to be. The king's message depended on precision. When it was done, Wallace's entrails were burned before him. Some turned away. One woman fainted, but most remained locked in by horror or duty. Finally came the quartering. Limbs severed, the head taken, each part destined for public display. Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, Perth. The head dipped in tar was set upon London Bridge, a warning more enduring than any proclamation. Flesh as parchment. This was what Edward understood best. A king does not merely rule, he performs. His justice is seen, not just heard. Wallace, once a symbol of defiance, was made a map of punishment. His body, now fragments, charted a kingdom's authority and its intolerance for disobedience. Yet something flickered in the silence after the crowd dispersed, in the way certain eyes lingered on the scaffold, not with triumph, but with something more fragile, pity perhaps, or unease. For all the grandeur of retribution, the fact remained, a man had borne more than most could dream of surviving. And even in pieces, Wallace refused to vanish from memory. The execution ended not with a cheer, but with the soft hush of ash scattered on the breeze. The king had made his point, but Scotland remembered not the ropes or the fire, but the defiance that had drawn them, and that perhaps was not what Edward intended. They brought him to London in chains. From the north he had come, dragged mile by mile through jeering towns, each stop along the road marked by gawping mouths and spitting contempt. Children ran behind the wagon that bore him. Old men leaned on staffs to see the legend in the flesh. Women whispered and crossed themselves. Bound hand and foot, William Wallace neither bowed his head nor offered speech. There was no dignity left in the display, but still he carried something in his bearing, a refusal to break fully, even as each village offered a fresh humiliation. He had been a soldier, a leader, a threat. Now he was a trophy. King Edward I had waited for this. Years of war, resistance, and rebellion had brought Scotland to its knees. But Wallace had remained unyielding, elusive, a ghost who would not bend. Edward wanted more than victory. He wanted submission, not just of the body, but of the memory. a symbol undone, reduced to blood and silence. So the sentence was chosen with care. The king knew the words weighted them with purpose, hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was no mere execution. It was spectacle, a statement inked in flesh. By the time Wallace reached Westminster, his face was thin hair, matted with the dust of many roads. The trial, such as it was, took place in Westminster Hall. The air inside carried the scent of damp stone and pressed bodies. Nobles, clerks, courtiers, some watched with curiosity, some with contempt. The charges were read in Latin: treason, sacrilege, murder. To them, it was theater. To him, it was absurdity. He had never sworn fealty to Edward, never acknowledged him as overlord. He said so plainly, "I could not be a traitor, for I was never his subject." There was no rebuttal. There was no need. The verdict had been decided before his feet touched English soil. The 23rd of August, 1305, dawned heavy and gray. A dampness hung over Smithfield, the execution ground. Already a crowd had gathered, Londoners drawn by the promise of violence sanctioned by royal justice. Traders shouted over one another, selling pies and tankards. Children clamored for better views. Some came to cheer, others came to remember. Wallace was tied to a hurdle and dragged behind horses through the muck of the streets. The procession moved slowly, deliberately past watching eyes and narrow windows. The filth of the city clung to him, his skin scraped raw by the dragging. Londoners roared with each jolt, a carnival of punishment. When he reached the gallows, the air thickened. Silence, brittle and expectant, fell like a veil. They hanged him not to death, but to the edge of it. They cut him down before the final breath. He gasped, a body fighting against itself, held upright only by pain. Then came the knives, and the unmaking began. His entrails burned before him, his limbs separated from his body. Each act was precise, deliberate part of the ritual. This was not just execution, it was grammar. Each cut a syllable, each cheer a full stop in the king's final sentence. Some turned away. Not all eyes could bear it, but many did. Some men laughed, others stood in awe, a few perhaps in shame. Justice, they were told, justice for a traitor. His head was taken to London Bridge, tarred, and displayed, a warning to all who might think themselves invincible. His limbs were scattered to Newcastle Barracks, Stirling, Perth, a map of dread stitched into the land itself. The message was clear: sovereignty lies not in the hearts of men, but in the hands of kings. To defy it is to be forgotten by anything but your pain. And yet, though they burned his body and scattered the rest, they could not stop the wind from carrying his name. The trial chamber smelled of lime plaster and damp wood. No one expected fairness, not the scribes recording the proceedings, not the guards shifting on their heels, and certainly not William Wallace bound in chains and facing men who had long since decided his fate. The outcome had been etched into royal will before the first charge was read aloud. The judges were English, all loyal to Edward. They made no pretense of impartiality. Wallace stood accused of treason, a charge that twisted the very notion of loyalty, for how could a man betray a king he had never sworn to? Yet the law, bent by conquest, served the crown's interest, not the truth. Beneath the legal phrasing was the clear aim to extinguish not only the man but the rebellion his name inspired. Additional charges were stacked high: murder for killing English soldiers in battle, sacrilege for seizing abbeys that had housed armed enemies. These were not uncommon acts in war, but here they became sins too great for redemption. They were not trying a soldier, they were condemning a symbol. When the sentence was read, it came draped in ceremonial weight, each word wielded like a hammer. Wallace was to be drawn through the streets on a hurdle, hanged by the neck, but cut down before death disemboweled alive his heart, and entrails burned before him, then beheaded, then quartered, his remains scattered to the corners of the kingdom. Each act held meaning. The dragging was humiliation his body offered to the dirt and stone. The hanging was a half-denial of life, a mockery of pardon. The disembowelment struck at the soul, his inner being laid bare and consumed. Quartering was the final blow, a dismantling of identity, a scattering of what had once stood unified. This was not merely execution, it was eradication. The morning of August 23, 1305, rose with unnatural stillness. The skies above London were clear. Warm sun lit the rooftops, but the city stirred not with peace, but anticipation. Scaffolds had been hammered into place for days. Merchants laid out wares as if for festival. Ale flowed. Meat smoked on spits. From country lanes and city alleys, people poured in eager for spectacle. The crowd swelled outside the tower. Wallace, gaunt and bruised, was stripped and bound to the hurdle. Horses snorted as the wooden frame was tied to their harness. As they moved slowly and deliberately, the wood scraped and bucked beneath him. The wheels clattered over stones. The rope at his wrists cut deeper with every jolt. Blood darkened the planks. Faces leaned in from the crowd, eyes bright with morbid thrill or grim duty. The procession wound through Cheapside and beyond a calculated route designed for maximum exposure. Wallace's body, dragged and broken, became the theater of power. Children pointed, vendors shouted. Rotten vegetables flew, some cried, parroting what they'd been told. Others simply watched silent and still unable or unwilling to join in the roar. The guards did nothing to shield him from the crowd's cruelty. That was part of the punishment. His humiliation was public property now, not his own. Over the hours, the journey became slower, not by design but by the growing weight of his wounds. His eyes by then no longer scanned the faces around him. Witnesses would later say he stared at nothing or at something only he could see. A distant hill, a home never returned to, the edge of a sky he would not reach. The scaffold stood tall at Smithfield. A priest muttered final rites, though Wallace's lips did not move in reply. When the rope tightened around his neck, there was no struggle. Not until it slackened and his body dropped into another round of torment was there movement again. The surgeons, if such a word fits, carried blades and iron hooks. What followed was the deliberate disassembly of a man in front of thousands. Some cheered, some looked away, a few wept. By the time his head fell, Wallace's body was no longer his. It belonged to Edward's message. The limbs were packed in salt sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Stirling. His head was dipped in tar and mounted on a spike atop London Bridge. It stared out over the Thames, silent now, but still speaking to all who passed. This is what defiance earns. And yet, even as the sentence concluded, the message could not fully control its meaning. For some, Wallace died a monster. For others, a martyr. The crown sought to erase him, but instead carved his image into history with every cut. What endured was not silence, but memory. The scaffold creaked under the weight of its purpose. A long summer sun clung to the sky, but the air in Smithfield held none of its warmth. The crowd had gathered early, spilling across the square with baskets and children ale mugs in hand, their boots grinding dry dust into the cobbles. Vendors shouted over one another, hawking bread pies and sugared almonds. The scene had all the marks of a fair, but the center of attention was no juggler nor preacher. At the heart stood William Wallace, bound, bruised, and half-starved. Stripped of armor, titles, and homeland, he was reduced now to a man with wrists chafed raw from chains. What thoughts turned behind those eyes no one could say. Some claimed he prayed. Others swore he stared at his captors without flinching lips, drawn tight but dry, no sign of pleading. He had made his stand against Edward's crown raised fire in the glens of Scotland, and now the king would answer rebellion not with justice, but with ritual. The punishment was not for the body alone. It was for memory, for legend, for example. Treason against the crown demanded spectacle. They brought him first by cart through the streets of London, tied backward, feet trailing in the filth, his head bobbed with every jolt of the wheel. The people leaned from windows, tossed scraps or jeers. Children laughed, men spat, and a few women wept quietly. His name had echoed across the borders, giant murderer, guardian, freedom fighter. To the English, he was a symbol of lawlessness. To Edward, he was unfinished business. At Smithfield, the scaffold rose in fresh-cut timber, erected not only for justice but for awe. It stood as an extension of the king's will, a message built in nails and rope and fire. The executioner, face hidden behind linen and sweat, moved with calm experience. He had done this before, dozens, maybe hundreds. Pain was his trade, and he knew how to stretch it. The noose was thick, coarse hemp, looped tight around Wallace's throat. It would not snap his neck. That would be mercy. Instead, it lifted him until his feet scraped the boards and his spine-arched legs twitching in midair. He hung there, muscles straining, jaw clenched, eyes bulging red with effort. The crowd's chatter fell to hush. He did not cry out. His body convulsed, then sagged. And just before the gray veil of unconsciousness could steal him away, they cut him down. Breath returned with the wet rasp. There was no pause. The knife flashed, neck small but sharp, curved for precision. The executioner opened the abdomen in a single practiced motion. Wallace's scream tore through the stillness like a cracked bell. It was raw and wounded, less a voice than something broken free of the soul. The crowd recoiled, and yet many leaned in. Curiosity, morbid as ever, bound them to the spectacle. From the open belly, the executioner pulled each organ, slowly raising it aloft before the flame that waited in an iron basin. Liver, intestines, stomach, each thrown into fire as if feeding an altar. The flames hissed with grease, and the stench curled into the lungs. It was not simply death. It was erasure. In medieval thought, the bowels housed not just the workings of digestion, but the seat of feeling grief, mercy, love. To burn them before Wallace's own eyes was to burn the man from inside out. Still, his eyes remained open. Some said he spoke then, muttered words none could catch, a whisper buried under the roar of blood and smoke. Others said his lips formed the shape of a name, God or Scotland or both. It mattered little. He had already become more than man and less than human in the same moment. Finally, the blade rose once more. The executioner did not delay. A single stroke of the axe took the head clean. The relief in that moment was almost visible, shoulders slackening, muscles unwinding as if death had gentled his limbs at last. But the ritual was not done. The head was held aloft, blood still dripping, before being lowered into a basket. The crowd cheered, a burst of release and triumph. Then came the quartering. The body was cut into 4 neat portions, each limb a trophy. 1 to Newcastle, 1 to Berwick, 1 to Stirling, and 1 to Perth. The head set upon a spike atop London Bridge, watched over the city that had condemned him. Edward had made his point. This was justice, not vengeance. This was how kings silenced the memory of rebellion, by making pain so visible, so intimate, so lasting, that no one dared take up sword again. But memories are not so obedient. They linger not in the muscle, but in the marrow. And in the silence that followed, amid the ash and soot and settling dust, even the victors looked away. They brought him south in chains. Through narrow streets and jeering crowds, the cart rumbled toward Smithfield. His face, weathered, streaked with sweat and dried blood, met the stares of merchants, children, and magistrates alike. Some watched with grim satisfaction, others looked away. The date was August 23, 1305. The man in chains was William Wallace. Condemned as a traitor, though he had never sworn loyalty to the English crown, Wallace stood accused of rebellion, of murder, of defying Edward Longshanks, King Edward I. The sentence had been handed down swiftly and without mercy, hanged, drawn, and quartered. Not just a punishment, but a performance of dominance. Justice as theater, justice as a warning. The scaffold stood high against the summer sky, its timbers dark with past blood. London's air was thick with smoke from the nearby cook fires, pungent with sweat and expectation. The crowd pressed forward, murmuring, jostling, waiting. First, they tied the ropes. His feet dangled as his body convulsed in the hanging, but they cut him down before death could take him. The law demanded he live, if only for the next stage. Stripped, splayed. The knife moved with practiced cruelty, beginning the drawing. The pain was not silent. Cries rang out and echoed between timbered houses and stone walls. English clerics recorded it in their chronicles. He did not flinch. One monk noted until the end. Another wrote of the crowd's awe. Some cheered, some stood pale, their own knees trembling beneath them. They tore his body open, the organs pulled from the cavity, while breath still fought in his chest. What little voice he had left no longer formed words. And when life had finally gone, the quartering began, each limb severed with deliberation, his body rendered into symbols. Edward, I had the remains dispatched Stirling, Berwick, Perth, and Newcastle. Each received a piece. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty to Scotland would earn dismemberment. Defiance would become display. Atop London Bridge, Wallace's head, preserved in tar, stared down upon the Thames for years. Crows nested near it. Tourists pointed. Children asked whose it was. This was justice in the mind of the king. Not just punishment, but politics. A body turned into a map of submission. The Scots would understand, he thought. They would break. And for a time it seemed they might. In the weeks following, fear walked openly in the Highlands. Nobles pledged allegiance. Those who once stood beside Wallace slipped into silence or exile. I saw the head myself, wrote an English merchant in a letter home. Never have I thought rebellion worth so grim a price. But pain does not always submit. The horror did not erase Wallace, it transfigured him. The cruelty, so precise, so public, became a rallying cry. Where once there was merely a man, now there was a martyr. Robert the Bruce, distant in blood but close in grief, watched the spectacle unfold from afar. This is England, he is said to have whispered, not in awe, but in cold calculation. He would rise soon enough. Future Scottish campaigns bore Wallace's shadow. Men fought harder, fled less, surrender grew rare. Captivity, after all, meant no trial, only ritual dismemberment. To be taken alive was to be made an emblem of obedience through agony. So instead they fought until the sword took them clean. Even beyond Scotland's glens and stone halls, word of Wallace's execution traveled. In Flanders, in France, in the courts of the continent, whispers spread about what England had done. Not merely the act, but the message: resistance shall be mutilated publicly and without mercy. Where kings might have seen strength, many saw terror. Where allies once stood, now came hesitation. The king had made his point etched in bone and blood, yet the scaffold had not silenced the cause, it had only deepened it. Wallace was no longer a man to be captured or forgotten. He was a wound stitched into the conscience of a nation, and wounds, unlike rebels, cannot be quartered. The cart trundled over the cobblestones with the rhythmic jolt of its wooden wheels, each turn echoing through the narrow lanes of London, as if time itself hesitated. August 23rd, 1305, St. Bartholomew's Day. The air was humid with the weight of anticipation and rot. People gathered early, pressing close to the edge of the route that led from the Tower to Smithfield. From butchers' stalls and alleys they came, not for justice, but for the spectacle. William Wallace, bound and stripped, was dragged behind the horse on a crude wooden hurdle. His face was swollen but still defiant, streaked with filth and dried blood. Eyes set forward, the rope around his wrists cut into skin already torn by shackles. He had refused confession, refused to plead for mercy. And so the procession began, not just to a scaffold, but toward a message King Edward I wished carved into flesh and bone. The charges had been read at Westminster Hall just days before treason against the king, murder, sacrilege of allegiance. Yet Wallace never saw himself as Edward's subject. His reply, simple, resolute, had been, "I could not be a traitor, for I was never his subject." It rang in the minds of those who witnessed it, a brief flicker of defiance in a world where kings ruled bodies and souls. The crowd spat and jeered, though some remained silent. Children, lifted onto shoulders, squinted toward the distant figure. Merchants leaned out of windows. The English court had orchestrated this moment with precision, its spectacle drawn as carefully as a royal seal. Every phase of what was to come had been documented, archived, not just for law but for legend. Smithfield Market, broad and open, awaited like a theater. A raised platform had been built. Guards cleared the center. From there, everything would be visible: the scaffold, the ropes, the brazier for the entrails. Wallace was lifted from the hurdle by force. His limbs barely responded. "Hear the king's will," the bailiff cried. No one misheard. The first punishment was hanging halfway between life and death. Wallace's body convulsed as the rope pulled tight, his throat squeezing against breath and silence. Yet he was cut down before the darkness could claim him, drawn back to awareness for the next act. A priest was offered again refused. He was stripped further, his body exposed to the judgment of the state. A knife traced the cruel script of treason. The crowd recoiled, then surged forward, unable to look away. His cries, though muted, traveled across the square, wordless declarations of agony. As his entrails were drawn and burned before his living eyes, the smoke rose like incense at a corrupted altar. Some men watched with hard faces, others turned away. The silence at times overpowered the shouting. A soldier near the scaffold wept quietly, unseen. The final act quartering. Limbs removed and destined for the far reaches of the realm, Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Stirling. The head would remain here, mounted above London Bridge, a warning with no words required. Edward's court understood symbolism. To dismember Wallace was to claim every corner of Britain as subject. His body became a map of dominion. This was not punishment, it was performance. And yet, amid the cruelty, a seed was sown. The chroniclers recorded not only the act, but the bearing of the man. John of Fordun would later write that Wallace bore his death with dignity, refusing to cower, refusing to renounce his cause. Witnesses, both English and Scottish, remembered the steadiness of his gaze. They remembered, too, the silence that followed, as if even the crowd sensed something had passed beyond the reach of ropes and knives. The execution ended with a strange stillness. No cheers, no songs, just the clatter of hooves and the return of daily life. In the centuries that followed, Wallace's death did not vanish into parchment or ash. It returned in verse and in voice. It became a wound that refused to scar over a story retold by firelight on battlegrounds, in songs sung quietly in defiance. The very excess of his punishment ensured he would never be forgotten. What King Edward sought to destroy became something greater, not a man but a memory, not silence but a legacy. Justice in that moment did not speak, but the people did, and they remembered. The cart trundled heavily through the muck of Smithfield. Iron-shod wheels struck against loose cobblestones, each jolt rattling the planks, and the man chained atop them. It was the 23rd of August, 1305. Summer heat hung over London like a woolen veil, thick with smoke, sweat, and the stench of flesh. Around the wooden frame of the cart, soldiers flanked the condemned Sir William Wallace, once guardian of Scotland's freedom, now stripped, shackled, and silent. He had already been dragged for miles from the tower, not walked, dragged. His body lashed down on raw timber skin, scraped against and splinters, hands bound behind his back so tightly the cords cut through. The crowd lining the route was not quiet. They called out slurs, spat, laughed. Some jeered as if at a fairground attraction. Others remained grim, watching behind drawn brows, their children hoisted to see better over shoulders. "That's the one," someone muttered, "the one who defied the king." King Edward had ordered it personally. Treason required spectacle. Treason was not a crime against mere men. It was an affront to the crown, the divine order, the spine of empire, and punishment had to match the message. The trial had been a formality. Wallace denied the charge of treason, claiming he had never sworn loyalty to Edward. "I could not be a traitor," he had said, "for I was never his subject." But the sentence was already sealed. He would be hanged, cut down while still alive, emasculated, eviscerated, his entrails burned before his eyes, his body quartered and the pieces sent to the corners of the kingdom as tokens of obedience. Smithfield was swollen by midday. Dignitaries from France, from Flanders, from Rome's orbit had gathered to bear witness. A king's justice was a tool of diplomacy as much as rule. The gallows stood prepared. The executioner waited face veiled not by shame but by tradition. Ropes had been tested, hooks laid out, the fire already stoked. Wallace said nothing as he was hauled from the cart. His feet dragged, his back hunched. Some say he looked skyward, others that he locked eyes with the crowd, defiant still. One monk tried to whisper a blessing. A guard struck him back. The rope tightened around his neck, and he was lifted. Legs kicked back, arched throat spasmed, but they cut the rope too soon. He collapsed onto the scaffold, gasping, veins, bulging skin, turning purple. No mercy, not by design. Clothes were torn from him. The blade flashed. He screamed. The crowd surged forward. Some turned away. Others laughed again. Bits of food were thrown, coins, too. Children gaped in curiosity. Women bit knuckles. An old man wept. They burned his entrails before his eyes, ritual, not cruelty, or so the law claimed. His eyes rolled back before it was done. Still alive, they say, as the axe came down to sever. One limb, another, a third. The fourth took longer, bone was stubborn. Blood pooled beneath the scaffold, soaking into the summer dust. Flies gathered instantly. The smell turned. His head was dipped in tar and later set atop London Bridge. The quarters were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, visible reminders that resistance would not be tolerated, that England's reach was long and punishment longer still. Edward wanted obedience. He got myth. The crowds eventually dispersed, stepping over stains. Some whispered of the rebels' courage, others only of the horror. But none left unchanged. Officials recorded the costs, filed the records, and moved on to the next. Months passed, years, and still they spoke his name, Wallace the martyr, Wallace the lion. They did not forget, not in the glens nor the courts of Europe. The brutality intended to silence gave the rebel new breath. I have stood where he died. I have seen the shadow of the scaffold in the cobbles, and I wonder how thin the line is between law and vengeance, between justice and warning. What endures is not the king's order, but the man's silence beneath the flame. His story, torn apart, yet never gone, speaks in every echo where freedom is weighed against fear. That day in Smithfield they thought they killed a man, but they created a legend, and legends, unlike bodies, do not burn.